Shalom, shalom, my Habarim. Greetings, my YouTube Mishpaha. What's up, my people? And welcome back to Bible on a Bicycle fan edits. Well, here in the Western world, folks is getting ready to celebrate that old Christ Mass. Everybody putting their trees up, talking about old Saint Nick and all that. Seems to me, folks forgotten what that whole Christ Mass was about. Supposed to have been there to celebrate the birth of Christ, Yeshua, Jesus, the Messiah. But for those of us in the know, we already know that is not actually the birth date of Yeshua. What? You don't take my word for it. To press my point, we're going to turn it over to the late, great Dr. Michael Heiser as we discuss the subject of when was the real birthday of Jesus. Alrighty, without any further ado, Dr. Michael Heiser.
Just read the text for what it actually says. In other words, if you let the text say what it says, and sometimes, believe it or not, the text just means what it says. Astrotheology. This notion that the ancients, Jews and Christians included, looked at the heavens and considered what was going on in the heavens as signs of God working out his will or God about to do something, sort of a prophetic flavor. Now, we see that generally in the Gospels, like with the second coming, there'll be the sign of the Son of Man or the signs in the heavens. We saw it in the book of Acts, with things that have already happened. So that's part of eschatology in biblical thinking. We're not talking about horoscopes and zodiacs and astrology the way astrologers today do. Look at the heavens and who am I going to marry? What kind of job am I going to have? Should I do this or that? That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the notion that among Jews and Christians that, hey, it was the God of Israel who created the things that we see in the sky, and he created them according to Genesis to mark times and seasons, days, the passage of time, which of course they knew meant the flow of human history, what happened on earth. Again, this as in heaven, so on earth sort of thing going on as well. That's what we're talking about. So let's be clear right up front with what I'm, the context of what I'm going to be saying and the context that isn't there, which is this modern silly notion of astrology as we think of it. So if we go to Romans 10, again, this is a familiar passage. A lot of people have even memorized parts of this passage. This is the chapter that talks about whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, Romans 10:13. But if you start in verse 5, you get the context for that. It's actually quite interesting and takes us into, believe it or not, this topic of astral prophecy. Paul, talks about the necessity of calling on the name of the Lord to be saved. And then he says, well, how are they going to do that if they've never heard? And for them to hear, you got to have someone, preaching and so on and so forth. So the problem is not everybody knows this, or so we think. Not everybody knows, what's going on here. And so when Paul says, sets this up, you think that that's just kind of it. Paul's going to say, look, this is why we're here. This is why we preach. We got to get people out there. We got to evangelize. And he does all that, and he says all that. But then he asks this question. Again, this is the kicker for me. This is what drew me in. Verse 18, but I ask, have they not heard? Indeed, they have. And then Paul quotes an Old Testament passage as his proof text that people everywhere have indeed heard about Jesus. Okay, what's going on here? Now, the passage that Paul quotes from the Old Testament is Psalm 19:4. Now, what Paul does here is he quotes from the Septuagint translation of Psalm 19:4. Again, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. For Paul, everyone had heard, or should have heard, about the coming of Jesus because, quote, their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. Well, whose voice is Paul talking about? If you go to Psalm 19, you find out he's talking about the heavens and the objects in the heavens. Let's read Psalm 19, first 4 verses. Again, this is also a familiar psalm. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Now you'll notice there, the fourth verse, their voice goes out through all the earth and their words to the end of the world. I'm reading from the ESV, and the ESV has in that verse adopted the Septuagint reading. Their voice goes out through all the earth. Now some of your Bibles may follow the Masoretic text here. Okay, we'll get to that in a moment because it says something different. It actually is going to mean the same thing, but it will say something different. Now, there are a number of terms in those first four verses that convey the idea that the heavens communicate information. Just think about what we just read. The heavens declare. The sky proclaims. The cycle of days and nights pours out speech and, quote, reveals knowledge. The heavens have a voice and speech and words that can be heard since their message, quote, goes out through all the earth. Again, it's very clearly attributing communication and the dispensing of information to the heavens. That's just a transparent reading of Psalm 19, and that's what Paul is tracking on. The key question, though, is how did Paul think the heavens communicated the coming of Jesus? I think Paul was thinking is that the stars specifically communicated the arrival of a divine king. So in that sense, Paul believes it is possible for the news about Jesus coming to be known to everyone because the heavens declare. Their voice, again, the voice of these heavenly objects, these celestial objects, goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. It is fallacious, though, to presume that the starry heavens could actually explain the way of salvation to someone when Christ himself sent the apostles in the world to preach the gospel. In other words, there's a reason he did that. If looking at the heavens was sufficient for evangelism, why would Jesus send out apostles? That I think what Paul is tracking on is that there were celestial events, celestial signs that could have and should have telegraphed to everyone that a divine king had come to earth. Okay, and specifically, we're going to get the story of the Magi that factors into this. So that's what I think Paul is doing. Now, Paul, I don't think Paul is thinking specifically of the star in Matthew 2. And by the way, that term in Matthew 2 is a term used of a wide range of celestial bodies. So it's not a star only like we think of it. It could have been a planet. And again, I'm going to agree with most astronomers that it was Jupiter, Jupiter's retrograde motion. That lone object, the star, by itself wouldn't telegraph anything. What they were looking at had a celestial context to them. This celestial object in Matthew 2, the Star of Bethlehem, and its behavior, its movement, if you're just looking at Matthew 2, you don't have the context for understanding what that is. If you weren't a magi, one of the magi, and you saw that thing in the sky, you wouldn't think anything of it because you lack the astronomical context, because this isn't what you do. You're a shepherd or you're something else. Well, the Magi understood the bigger picture. They could single out this object and understand what it was meaning because they knew the wider context. Is there anything in the New Testament that might give us that context, that might give the star of Matthew 2 the context that the Magi had? There is a context for that in the New Testament. It's found in a passage that few New Testament scholars associate with the birth of Jesus, which is ironic, especially since this passage says what it says in conjunction with the birth of the Messiah. Since it's in the last book of the New Testament, that isn't part of the birth narrative in the Gospels. People don't make the connection, but the connections are there if you just read the text for what it actually says. In other words, if you let the text say what it says. And sometimes, believe it or not, the text just means what it says. So Revelation 12 is the passage I'm talking about, specifically the first 7 verses or so. Now, an important note here before I read Revelation 12. None of what I say should be construed as Old Testament messianic prophecy. What Revelation 12 describes in terms of astronomy, reading it as an example of astral prophecy, was not prophesied in the Old Testament anywhere. What we have in Revelation 12 is a record of what the Magi saw in a wider lens that was codified by John well after the birth of Jesus. Now, it's unreasonable to presume that John concocted the material after the fact, even though Revelation 12 was written well after the birth. You couldn't arbitrarily pick a day, time, and year, or arbitrarily pick something going on in the heavens that happened not when you're writing, but at some other point. You couldn't arbitrarily, unintelligently pick something like that and get lucky that the thing you picked works everywhere else chronologically and calendrically in terms of events of Jesus' life. Not only that, but all the other events of the New Testament, because this date that Revelation 12 produces does that. It works. It fits in with everything else. So I think it's a real stretch to say, oh, John just got real lucky. Just a highly intelligent guess. No. Now, here's Revelation 12. It reads as follows. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. Verse 4, his tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1260 days. Now, it's quite clear that the signs in the heavens here in Revelation 12, what John is specifically looking at, again, he says, I looked up at the heavens and saw, okay? They're indisputably astronomical. Sun, moon, and stars are specifically mentioned. The specific signs, though, require some attention. Let's take the woman first. The woman is the key figure, the logical starting point for interpreting Revelation 12 astronomically. Now, since the woman clearly gives birth to the Messiah, okay, there's this quotation from the Psalms, the one who is to rule the nations with a rod of iron. It's very clearly messianic. The woman gives birth to the Messiah. And then the Messiah is taken up to heaven. That's a reference to the ascension. So you get here in Revelation 12 the birth of the Messiah and the ascension. And then the woman gets persecuted and has to flee into the desert. Since those are the factors, scholars agree that verses 2 through 6 reveal that this woman is a picture of the faithful community, Israel, which existed both before and after the coming of Christ. Israel, of course, is described as the Virgin of Zion in the Old Testament and produces the Messiah in fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. 2 Kings 19:21, Isaiah 37:21, Jeremiah 14:17, again, the Virgin of Zion. Again, Israel is the Virgin of Zion. Now, more specifically, when it comes to the actual birthing of the Messiah, Mary comes to mind as the Jewish girl who gives birth to Jesus, but Virgin Israel best fits both parts of the description of the woman in Revelation 12. In other words, if it was just the birth, well, then we might be thinking exclusively of Mary. But since we have the birth, the ascension, and then even subsequent to the ascension, the woman fleeing into the wilderness, Israel actually fits better. Both things are going on, but Israel, is sort of the primary referent here. The same pattern of flight is observable with Elijah and Moses, again, who symbolize the church in Revelation 11. Isaiah and other prophets, again, do the same thing. You get this is very rich Old Testament imagery, in other words, and so again it points back to Israel as the Virgin of Zion. So we've got both Mary and Israel the primary referent point. The connection to Virgin Israel is important, given that the signage would have to be decipherable to Jews at the time of Jesus' birth, and at that time Mary's circumstances would have been entirely unknown. The meaning of the Virgin and the 12 stars around her head is evident in Second Temple period Jewish literature, as well as later rabbinic thought. So even the 12 stars which if we look at this astronomically, obviously the Virgin is going to be Virgo, and Virgo does have 12 stars around her head and all that. But if you look at it textually, and specifically in terms of Jewish literature, the 12 stars around the head are going to be a reference to the 12 tribes of Israel. And so the woman, again, is Virgin Zion, Israel. This identification is based on the Old Testament precedent in which the sun, moon, and 11 stars represent Jacob, his wife, and the 11 tribes of Israel. That's Genesis 37:9. That was Joseph's dream. They bow down to Joseph, who represents the 12th tribe and the 12th star. There is a rich tradition within the Second Temple and, of course, the Christian and the rabbinic community later on that identify Israel as the Virgin Zion and align her with this sort of vision, the Virgin with the 12 stars. So when John uses it, this would have been completely familiar to Jewish readers, completely familiar. And if you're looking at the sky, again, Virgo is the obvious reference point. The description that the woman was clothed with the sun is stock astronomical language of the day for the sun being in the midst of a constellation. While the sun is in the woman, the moon is at her feet. For this situation to occur, the constellation of the woman must be in astronomical language on the ecliptic, the imaginary line in the sky that the sun and the moon follow in their journey through the zodiac constellations. When Paul quotes Psalm 19 as his proof text that, hey, everybody should have known a divine king was born, he says their voice goes out through all the earth. Okay, he quotes the Septuagint. The Masoretic text reads, their line goes out through all the earth. And some of your translations might have that. Well, the line would be a reference to the ecliptic. If you look at Revelation 12, this is a constellation, Virgo, the Virgin, the sun is in her midst, the moon is at her feet. And that means, again, if you're going to align those things, that means that we need to start paying attention to Virgo. And Virgo is on the ecliptic, the imaginary line through which the constellations follow through the sky. Again, the Masoretic text would align very well with what we're talking about here, not just the Septuagint. This clothing of the woman by the sun occurs for a 20-day period each year. This 20-degree spread could indicate the general time when Jesus was born. The constellation of the Virgin giving birth to the Messiah would, of course, have been viewed as quite coherent by the Magi, especially if they knew about Isaiah 7:14. If the Magi knew of Isaiah 7:14, and linked it to the Davidic dynasty, this idea of a virgin, Virgo, that they would look at that and go, boy, there's that thing in the Old Testament that read, this virgin shall conceive, and, maybe we ought to go look at that. But even if they were ignorant of Isaiah 7:14, the astrotheological linkage would still make sense to them, since the sign we know as Virgo had strong associations with other ancient, quote-unquote, mother goddesses, figures that would produce divine kings. So even if they were totally ignorant of Isaiah 7, what they would have been looking at, would have been a neon sign for divine royal birth. But the fact that they go to Bethlehem tells you, again, that they were familiar with the Hebrew scriptures. Now, the detail that the moon was located under the feet of the woman, Virgo, must not be forgotten in all this. The sun must be in the Virgo constellation while the moon is simultaneously at her feet. Somewhere at under the feet, somewhere there. That condition has to be present for John's vision to be accurately interpreted astronomically. Because of the moon's, quote-unquote, behavior relative to the ecliptic and Virgo in any given year, the 20-day window narrows to roughly a 90-minute period in which to astronomically pinpoint the birth of the child of Revelation 12, which is the Messiah, which was Jesus. Let's talk about the child a little bit. Revelation 12:5 is very explicit that the child is Jesus, the promised Messiah. Quote, she gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with the rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Reference to the birth and the ascension. Now, this description is an allusion to Psalm 2, verses 7 through 9, which prophesied that the Messiah would defeat God's enemies and be installed as ruler over all the nations. The psalm allusion is coupled with a description of an ascent of the child up to God and his throne. In short, John's wording here in the immediate context is designed to create the impression that it appeared as if the devil had won the day. The dragon's right there waiting to kill the child when it's born. The child's going to be killed and devoured. But the resurrection and, of course, the ascension, the ultimate return to the right hand of God, resulted in victory for the Messiah, for the child, and the dragon was therefore defeated. The child, we're very clear who that is. Now the dragon, third figure, the dragon. The scholars of the book of Revelation have long noted the connection of the dragon to Old Testament terminology for the sea monster that symbolized chaos. It also signified nations that stood against God and his people, because the nations become agents of chaos, agents of destruction, agents of destroying the order God wants, which of course includes this thing called Israel and the Messiah, because we want to restore Eden. The question we might pose now is, which constellation does John label as the red dragon, the dragon in the south? Immediately above Hydra and accompanying it are the constellations of Corax and Crater, which have 7 and 10 stars respectively. Corax with 7, corresponding to the number of heads in Revelation 12, lies closer to Virgo, ancient Scorpio, originally a larger set of stars than the present constellation. It was truly gigantic, even by celestial zodiac standards, since it originally consisted of 2 modern zodiacal signs, Libra and Scorpio. Both options are sort of workable and possible. Again, pick the one that you like. So this collection in Revelation 12 isn't rare, although to be fair, there's only a handful of dates in real time that could accommodate them in the context of New Testament chronology for the birth of Jesus. But those dates narrow to one date, once other astronomical events that occurred at the same time, which are not noted in Revelation 12, are added to the celestial profile. One of these extra events is, in fact, the leading candidate for explaining the star seen by the Magi in Matthew 2. Now, what I'm going to cover here is just the basics. The constellation directly above the head of Virgo. Again, this is stuff not mentioned in Revelation 12, but if we're looking at the sky like the Magi did, that constellation above the head of Virgo, the very next one in the zodiac, is Leo, the lion. Now, the lion was the symbol associated with the tribe of Judah, from which the Messiah would come. The association arose from Genesis 49, 9 and 10, where Jacob blessed Judah, referring to him in leonine terms, while prophesying that a ruler would come from his lineage. This is where the Lion of Judah imagery comes from. It's part of the Torah. The lion-king association is confirmed in Revelation 5, verse 5. Quote, "One of the elders said to me, 'Weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered.'" The constellation Leo then was associated by Jews, Jewish astro-theologians, if you want to call them that, with royalty. The constellation of Leo is also important to Gentiles. It was the chief or head sign of the zodiac and had special importance in astrological circles. Leo was considered a royal constellation since it was dominated by the star Regulus. Regulus would have also been in the picture, again, the recreation of the circumstances of Revelation 12. So the star Regulus was known by astrologers as the king star. It was big and bright, okay? So we have the king constellation, all right, the king constellation, Leo, Lion of Judah, and the star Regulus in that constellation, in Leo. The status of Regulus in Leo is important because on one of the possible dates for the Messianic birth, it came into conjunction with Jupiter. As the largest planet, Jupiter was considered the king planet in astro-theological thinking of the first century. As a result, the constellation Leo, the Messianic sign of the Lion of Judah, to Jews who read the heavens, literally here, had 2 conjoined signs of a royal birth within it. So in other words, if you're the Magi, if you're looking at this sign, you've got a virgin with 12 stars, the sun in her midst, the moon at her feet, the dragon. Okay, then above that you've got Leo, the lion. It's the symbol of the tribe of Judah. And within that constellation, you have Jupiter, the king planet, and Regulus, the king star, overlapping. They're conjoined at this moment. Remember, we're talking about a 90-minute window where all these things are there. So the combination of astronomical signs produces a unique set of circumstances which can only be accounted for by one date that matters in the sweep of New Testament chronology. This date has dramatic significance in the Jewish calendar. According to all these signs in the heavens, the date of Jesus' birth, the birth of the Messiah, was September 11th, 3 BC.
Well, holy ho, ho, ho. Let's think about that. If you weren't aware before, hopefully you're a little bit more educated. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not here to be the Grinch and crush all that Christmas joy. I personally won't be putting up a tree, but any opportunity that I get, Christmas or otherwise, to bring up the subject of Yeshua HaMashiach, well, I'll take it. But for those of you who do celebrate Christmas, I hope you're doing it in remembrance of that Christ, Yeshua, while you're all caught up with the festivities. Anyway, that's my opinion on it. I'd be interested in what you got to say about this whole birthday of Yeshua in those comments down below. You know the routine. While you're heading down that way, if you're not already, why not hit that subscribe button? Give us a little bit of love right next door to that thumbs up, and make sure that you hit that share button and share this here little video with any friends or family members that you think might enjoy or benefit from this here little video. Hope to see you here next time. And until next time, remember, Yeshua, Jesus loves you. And so do I. Now get off here, go ride your bike, and read your Bible.